The salt spray hangs in the air like a fine silver veil, clinging to the jagged cliffs of the Outer Hebrides and the windswept reaches of the Orkney Isles. If you were to stand there today, at the very edge of the North Atlantic, the wind would tell you a story of endurance, a low rhythmic thrumming that has echoed across these headlands for longer than our modern minds can easily grasp. Beneath the soft, damp moss and the purple heather lies a foundation of ancient gneiss, a rock so old it seems to hold the memory of the earth's first cooling, and atop this bedrock, silhouetted against a sky that shifts from bruised violet to pale slate, stand the giants. They are the megaliths, great stones, some weighing many tons, dragged from distant quarries and raised toward the heavens by hands that have been dust for 5,000 years. To look upon them is to feel a strange, quiet pull, a sense that we are standing in the presence of a mystery that predates the written word, the rise of kings, and even the very concept of a city. We often think of the great pyramids of Giza as the starting point of monumental architecture, the first great feat of human engineering that challenged the horizon. Yet, long before the first stone was laid for Khufu's tomb, and centuries before the famous trilithons of Stonehenge were hoisted into place on the Salisbury Plain, these northern circles were already ancient. They stood as silent sentinels in a world that was still waking up from the long, frozen slumber of the last ice age. At places like Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, or the ring of Brodgar in Orkney, the stones form perfect, haunting geometries that suggest a profound understanding of the stars, the seasons, and the mathematics of the natural world. How did a people we once dismissed as simple hunter-gatherers or primitive farmers possess the clarity of vision to align these pillars with the midwinter sunset or the complex cycles of the moon? It is a question that whispers through the tall grass, a question that invites us to journey back through 10,000 years of history to find the engineers of the deep past. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day begin to drift away, you are joining a long lineage of watchers. For millennia, humans have looked at these same stars and felt the same need to find order in the vastness. Before we travel further into the fog of the North Atlantic, perhaps you are finding a sense of peace in these old stories. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather these fragments of the past to help you find rest, sharing new history narrations every single day. If you find these journeys into deep time a comfort as you drift towards sleep, you might consider subscribing to our collection so you never miss a night story. A gentle like on the video also helps our quiet archive reach others who are seeking a moment of calm. Now let us return to the edge of the sea, where the first stones are waiting to be turned. The story of these North Atlantic circles begins not with the stones themselves, but with the changing face of the planet. Roughly 12,000 years ago, the world was gripped by a sudden, sharp return to glacial conditions known as the Younger Dryas. It was 1,000-year winter, a time when the ice sheets that had been retreating began to push back, and the lush forests of Europe turned once more to tundra. This was a period of intense pressure for the small groups of humans navigating the landscape, yet it may have been the very crucible that forged a new kind of society. When the warmth finally returned, it did so with a startling speed. Sea levels began to rise as the glaciers melted, and the land we now call Great Britain and Ireland was slowly severed from the European mainland. The North Sea, once a vast plain known as Doggerland, was swallowed by the waves, leaving behind a series of islands and archipelagos. In this new maritime world, the sea was not a barrier, but a highway. The people who inhabited these coastlines were master navigators, moving in skin-covered boats through the treacherous currents of the Minch and the Pentland Firth. They carried with them a culture that was increasingly focused on the permanent and the profound. We see this first in their burials. The great chambered cairns like Maeshowe, where the dead were laid to rest in sophisticated stone vaults covered by massive mounds of earth. But soon their ambition turned outward, from the world of the dead to the world of the living and the cosmic. They began to mark the land with standing stones, or menhirs, often placed at significant points in the landscape where the earth meets the sky. The transition from these single stones to the great circles represents a leap in human cooperation that is difficult to overstate. To build the ring of Brodgar, which spans over 100 meters in diameter, required a community to organize hundreds of laborers. They had to excavate a massive ditch out of solid sandstone bedrock using nothing but deer antlers and stone tools, a task that archaeologists estimate took over 80,000 man-hours. They had to identify the specific stones they wanted, sometimes miles away, and transport them across boggy terrain and open water. This was not the work of a few families. It was the work of a civilization. And yet, there is no evidence of a central palace, no statues of a divine emperor, and no written records of their laws. There is only the architecture of the sky. When we look at the stratigraphy, that is, the layers of soil and debris that accumulate over time, we find that these sites were used and modified for thousands of years. They were not built in a single generation and then forgotten. Instead, they were living landscapes, places of pilgrimage where people gathered from across the islands to witness the turning of the year. At the winter solstice, the sun would align perfectly with the entrance of a tomb or the gap between two specific stones, casting a long golden finger of light into the darkness. It was a way of tethering the human experience to the infinite, a way of proving that even in the coldest, darkest depths of the northern winter, the light would eventually return. Radiocarbon dating. The process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material has recently pushed the dates of these northern sites further back than we ever imagined. We now know that the heart of Neolithic Orkney was a thriving centre of innovation long before the first stones were hauled to Stonehenge. It is a humbling thought that while the rest of the world was just beginning to experiment with agriculture, these northern islanders were already master architects, astronomers, and engineers. They lived in a world of grey stone and green grass, of crashing waves and screaming gulls, yet they possessed a mental map of the universe that was precise and beautiful. As the centuries stretched into millennia, the purpose of the circles may have shifted. What began as a place to track the sun may have become a temple to ancestors, or a neutral ground where different tribes could meet to trade and marry. We find pottery fragments and flint tools from distant regions, suggesting that these circles were the hubs of a vast prehistoric network that spanned the entire North Atlantic. But despite the evidence of their activity, the people themselves remain ghosts. We do not know their names, their language, or the stories they told around their fires at night. We only have the whispers of the stones, those weathered, lichen-covered giants that continue to stand, indifferent to the passage of empires. There is a particular stillness that comes over these sites at twilight. The wind seems to drop, and the shadows of the stones lengthen across the grass, reaching out like the hands of a sundial. In this half-light, it is easy to imagine the landscape as it was 10,000 years ago, a world of raw, unmapped beauty, where every hill and every bay held a spirit. The engineers of the Ice Age did not seek to conquer this nature, but to harmonize with it. They built their circles in natural amphitheatres, surrounded by hills that mimicked the curves of the stones. They chose materials that sparkled with quartz or glowed with red sandstone, ensuring that their creations would catch the light in specific, intentional ways. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific sites and the science that is finally beginning to unlock their secrets, Let yourself drift on the rhythm of the waves. The history of the North Atlantic is a long, slow tide, an ebb and flow of ice and warmth, of rising seas and emerging cultures. We are merely the latest visitors to these shores, standing on the shoulders of those who first looked at the stars and decided to build something that would last forever. The stones are patient. They have waited through the rise and fall of Rome, the coming of the Vikings, and the birth of the modern age. And they will wait for us too, as we seek to understand the ancient mind that first dreamed of circles in the mist. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a world beginning to breathe again. It is not the sound of bird song or the rustle of leaves, but the deep, groaning crack of mountains of ice shifting under the weight of a warming sky. For thousands of years, the North Atlantic had been a kingdom of silence, locked beneath a white shroud that reached miles into the atmosphere. But as the era we call the Pleistocene began to wane, a profound transformation took hold of the earth. The great glaciers, which had once stretched as far south as the heart of Europe and the Midlands of North America, began to weep. This was the dawn of the Holocene, a time of geological rebirth, yet it was a slow and staggering process that unfolded over generations so numerous they dwarf our recorded history. As the ice retreated, it did not simply vanish. It surrendered the land in a series of violent and beautiful spasms. Enormous meltwater lakes, trapped behind walls of ice, would suddenly burst, carving canyons in a single afternoon and sending floods of cold, fresh water into the salt-heavy seas. The weight of the ice had been so immense that the very crust of the earth had been pushed down into the mantle, and now, as that weight lifted, the land began to rise in a slow tectonic sigh. Islands that had been submerged for an eternity began to poke their rocky heads above the grey waves of the Atlantic, and vast plains, once hidden, stretched out to greet the sun. This was a shifting, liquid world, where the map was rewritten every century, and the horizon was never quite where your grandfather had claimed it to be. Into this unstable landscape stepped the first pioneers. We often imagine them as desperate or primitive, but these were the master survivors of the human story. They were small bands of nomadic hunters and gatherers, people who understood the language of the wind and the subtle shifts in the colour of the sea. They followed the retreating ice not out of curiosity, but because the ice was the source of life. Along its melting edges, the nutrient-rich waters bloomed with plankton, attracting massive schools of fish, which in turn drew in the seals, the whales, and the great seabirds. On land, the newly exposed tundra provided a temporary home for reindeer and elk. These people were the shadows of the glacier, moving north as the world opened up before them, their feet finding paths through valleys that had not felt the warmth of the sun for 100,000 years. They travelled in skin-covered boats, navigating the treacherous fringes of the North Atlantic, where the fog rolls in so thick it feels like a physical weight against the skin. We can almost see them, huddled together against the damp chill, the rhythmic dip of their paddles the only sound against the vastness of the ocean. They were looking for something specific, though they may not have had a name for it yet. They were looking for stability. In a world defined by rising tides and shifting permafrost, they sought the high ground, the places where the bedrock was firm and the view of the heavens was unobstructed by the towering walls of ice that still lingered in the interior. It was during this period of transition, roughly 12,000 years ago, that these nomadic groups encountered the first stable landmasses of the far north. These were not the lush forests we know today, but stark, windswept plateaus of granite and gneiss, scoured clean by the passing glaciers. These places felt different. Here the earth did not tremble with the melting frost, and the sea, though ever present, felt like a neighbour rather than an intruder. Archaeologists using radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic remains, have found traces of these early encampments tucked into the lee of great cliffs. But as we look closer at the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that tell the story of time, we find something that challenges our understanding of the nomadic mind. In these remote corners of the Atlantic fringe, from the outer reaches of Scotland to the rugged coastlines of Norway and beyond, we begin to see the first evidence of something permanent. These pioneers were not just passing through, they began to mark the land. Perhaps it started with a simple pile of stones to navigate through the mist, or a hearth built of heavy slabs to shield a fire from the gale. But as the centuries turned into millennia, these functional markers evolved into something far more ambitious. They found the places where the earth felt solid beneath their feet, and there they began to move stones that no small group of hunters should have been able to lift. We must ask ourselves what drove a people who owned only what they could carry to commit themselves to the labor of giants. The geological record tells us that this was a time of great celestial activity. The atmosphere, clearing of the dust and moisture of the Ice Age, would have revealed a night sky of terrifying clarity. The stars were not just lights, they were a map, a calendar, and perhaps a pantheon. As the land stabilized, the people began to mirror the order they saw in the heavens. They sought out the high, flat places, the plateaus that offered a 360-degree view of the horizon. These were the first cathedrals, built not of wood or brick, but of the very bones of the earth itself. There is a period known to science as the Younger Dryas, a sudden 1,000-year return to Ice Age conditions that struck just as the world was beginning to warm. It was a time of intense hardship, a final bitter winter that lasted for 10 generations. In the traditional view of history, such a crisis should have sent humanity back into a struggle for mere survival. Yet, it is precisely in the wake of this cold snap that we see the most profound evidence of engineering. It is as if the uncertainty of the climate drove these early pioneers to create something that could not be moved by wind or tide. They were seeking an anchor in a world that had proven itself to be frighteningly fluid. As the ice finally surrendered its grip for the last time, these engineers of the dawn were ready. They had identified the sacred geometries of the coastlines. They knew where the sun rose on the shortest day of the year and where the moon reached its furthest point on the horizon. They were no longer just followers of the ice, they were the masters of the stone. The land masses they chose, the Orkney Islands, the Hebrides, the rugged peninsulas of Brittany, were once the high points of a lost world, places that stood firm while the plains around them were swallowed by the rising Atlantic. The discovery of these stable landmasses allowed for a shift in the human psyche. When you know where you will be in a year's time, or where your children will be buried, your relationship with time itself begins to change. The nomadic now becomes a permanent forever. They began to look at the great boulders left behind by the retreating glaciers, erratics, as geologists call them, and they saw more than just obstacles. They saw the raw material for a conversation with the infinite. They were the first to realize that while the ice would melt and the seas would rise, the stone would remain. And so, as the mists of the early Holocene began to lift, the stage was set. The pioneers had become settlers, and the settlers were becoming architects. They stood on the edge of a new world, a world of greening valleys and teeming seas, but their eyes remained fixed on the grey, silent stones and the circling stars above. They were preparing to build the first of the great circles long before the first stone was ever turned at Stonehenge, in a time when the memory of the ice was still a cold shiver in the blood of the elders. The journey from the melting glacier to the standing stone was a journey of the soul, a slow, deliberate march toward the realization that man could leave a mark upon the earth that even time itself would struggle to erase. Before the first heavy weight of granite or sandstone was ever dragged across the thawing tundra, there was the smell of freshly cut sapwood and the rhythmic thud of stone axes against timber. We often imagine the megalithic age as one of cold, silent rock, but its true ancestors were the forests. In the damp, burgeoning woods of the post-glacial north, these early engineers first expressed their vision in wood, planting tall, straight trunks of oak and pine into the dark earth to mirror the trees that surrounded them. These timber circles were the sketches, the ephemeral blueprints for what was to come. They were living monuments that breathed with the seasons, eventually rotting and returning to the soil, teaching the people that if they wished to speak to the future, they would need a material that did not decay. The transition from wood to stone was not merely a change in building material, but a profound shift in human consciousness, a decision to step out of the cycle of biological growth and into the realm of geological time. To move a stone is to challenge the earth itself. As the climate stabilized and the nomadic patterns of the younger Dryas, that final bitter cold snap that lasted over 1,000 years, began to fade into the warmer Holocene, the ambition of these builders grew. They sought out the bones of the earth, the massive erratics left behind by retreating glaciers, and began to contemplate the impossible. Moving a block of stone weighing 30 tons is not a feat of muscle alone. It is a feat of mathematics, friction, and collective will. Imagine the scene on a crisp morning 10,000 years ago. There are no iron chains, no pulleys, no wheels. Instead, there is the clever application of grease, animal fat, and the smooth bark of felled saplings used as rollers. By utilizing the simple physics of the lever and the inclined plane, these people were able to bypass the limits of the human frame. They understood the subtle language of gravity, how to balance a massive weight so perfectly that a small group of people could tip the scales of physics. They used saturated clay to slick the path and braided ropes of lime bast fiber, strong enough to hold the tension of a mountain being moved. It was a slow, agonizingly patient process, a literal inching toward the sacred. The very act of transport was likely a ritual in itself, a communal pilgrimage where every hand on the rope was a thread in the social fabric, binding the tribe together through a shared, monumental burden. And so, the circle began to take its place as the primary geometry of the human spirit. But why a circle? In the vast, open landscapes of the North Atlantic, where the horizon stretches out in an unbroken ring around the observer, the circle is the only shape that feels true to the world. It is the shape of the sun that warmed their skin and the moon that guided their nights. It is the shape of the horizon itself, the boundary between the known and the infinite. To build in a circle was to create a microcosm, a small ordered world that reflected the greater order of the cosmos. Within the perimeter of the stones, time felt different. The chaos of the wild landscape was excluded, and a sense of stillness took hold. In these early stages of engineering, the circle served as a vessel for thought. Archaeologists, using radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us exactly how long ago a piece of organic matter died, have found that many of these sites were occupied and modified for centuries. The stratigraphy, or the layering of the earth, tells a story of constant return. A timber post would be removed, and in its place a stone would be raised. It was a slow-motion transformation, a hardening of the heart of the community. They were building a bridge between the fleeting life of a human and the eternal life of the stars. As the years passed, the sophistication of these layouts increased. The builders began to notice how the shadows of the stones lengthened and shortened with the turning of the year. They realized that by placing a stone just so, they could capture the exact moment the sun peaked on the longest day, or the moon reached its furthest point on the horizon. The circle became a clock, a calendar, and a map all at once. It was a way of anchoring themselves in a world that was still shifting and changing as the last of the ice melted into the rising seas. They were no longer just inhabitants of the land, they were its architects, carving their understanding of the universe into the very landscape. The physics of these structures also reveals a deep understanding of the Earth's own stresses. To stand a tall, narrow stone upright and ensure it does not topple for 5,000 years requires an intuitive grasp of center of gravity and soil compaction. They dug deep sockets into the subsoil, packing them with smaller packing stones, wedges of flint and quartz that acted like a vice, holding the giant upright against the buffeting winds of the Atlantic. There is a silent elegance in this, a hidden engineering that lies beneath the turf, unseen by the casual observer, but essential to the monument's survival. Meanwhile, the spiritual weight of the circle continued to deepen. In the silence of the north, where the wind is often the only voice, the stones stood as sentinels. They represented the ancestors, perhaps, or the gods of the wind and wave, but more than that, they represented a boundary. To step inside the circle was to leave the mundane world behind and enter a space where the veil between the now and the forever was thin. The circular shape meant there was no head, no foot, no hierarchy. Everyone within the ring was equidistant from the center, a communal arrangement that suggests a society built on cooperation rather than the dictates of a single ruler. As we look back through the mist of deep time, we see that these Ice Age engineers were not primitive in their thinking. Their tools were simple, yes, but their grasp of the fundamental forces of the universe, gravity, time, and geometry, was profound. They did not build these circles because they had to, but because they felt a need to harmonize their lives with the rhythms they observed in the sky. The stones were a way of saying, "We are here, we understand, and we will not be forgotten." Each block of stone moved, each socket dug, and each pillar raised was a testament to a vision that saw far beyond the horizon of a single lifetime. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a chisel striking siltstone, a rhythmic metallic ring that carries across a treeless landscape of emerald green and slate-grey water. To understand the true origins of the megalithic mind, we must travel north, far beyond the rolling hills of Salisbury Plain, to a place where the wind never truly stops its restless wandering. Here, in the Orkney Islands, off the northernmost tip of Scotland, lies a landscape that challenges everything we once believed about the direction of human progress. For decades, the narrative of history suggested that culture flowed from the south to the north like a warming current. But the stones tell a different story, a story of a cultural explosion that began in these remote, salt-sprayed islands and radiated outward, eventually giving birth to the wonders of Stonehenge and Avebury. The heart of this northern mystery beats loudest at the Ness of Brodgar. It is a narrow strip of land, a thin finger of earth separating two vast bodies of water, the brackish loch of Stennis and the freshwater loch of Harray. In this liminal space, where earth, sky and water meet in a constant shifting dance, archaeologists discovered something that defied all expectations. It was not merely a few scattered hearths or a small village, but a massive, sprawling complex of stone buildings, a cathedral city of the Stone Age that flourished over 5,000 years ago. As the layers of earth were carefully peeled away, revealing walls over 4 meters thick and stones shaped with a precision that seems almost impossible for the era, the true significance of Orkney began to emerge. This was the center of the world, a prehistoric hub of innovation and spiritual intensity that drew people from hundreds of miles away. The scale of the Ness is difficult to grasp in our modern age of steel and glass. Imagine a series of structures, some as large as modern parish churches, enclosed by a massive stone wall that marked the boundary between the sacred and the profane. These were not simple dwellings for families to huddle in against the cold. They were temples, great halls of assembly, and places of ritual transformation. The stratigraphy, that is, the layers of soil and debris that accumulate over centuries, reveals a continuous occupation that lasted for over 1,000 years. During this time, the people of the Ness were not merely surviving. They were thriving, creating a society of such complexity that it required a sophisticated level of social stratification. When we look at the sheer volume of stone moved to this narrow neck of land, we are looking at the evidence of shared labor on a monumental scale. Tens of thousands of tons of sandstone were quarried, transported, and shaped. This was not the work of a few wandering families. It was the result of a collective will, a society capable of organizing hundreds, perhaps thousands of individuals toward a single transcendent goal. There is a profound stillness in the ruins today. But 5 millennia ago, this place would have been a hive of activity. You can almost hear the low murmur of voices in the great halls, the smell of roasting meat from communal feasts, and the sight of smoke rising from hearths that were never allowed to go cold. Within these walls, researchers found something even more startling: evidence of art and aesthetics. The stones were not just functional, they were decorated. Thousands of examples of prehistoric art have been uncovered, incised lines, zigzags, and geometric patterns carved into the very skin of the buildings. Even more surprising was the discovery of pigment. These were not drab, grey ruins in their prime. They were vibrant, colourful spaces with stones painted in shades of red, yellow, and black. It suggests a people who found beauty as necessary as bread, a culture that invested immense energy into the visual language of their surroundings. As the years passed, the Ness of Brodgar became a crucible of ideas. It is here that we see the first appearances of grooved ware pottery, a distinct style of ceramic that would eventually spread across the entirety of Britain and Ireland. This pottery was more than just a container. It was a cultural signature, a shared identity that linked the remote islands of the north to the chalk downs of the south. The people of Orkney were the architects of a new way of living, a new way of relating to the land and to each other. They were the engineers of a social fabric that was as durable as the stones they raised. And so, we must ask ourselves what kind of mind conceived of such a place. To build the Ness, one needed more than just physical strength. One needed a mastery of geometry and an understanding of the long-term stability of the earth. The foundations were laid with a foresight that spanned generations. They understood how to drain the land, how to support massive roof structures, and how to align their buildings with the movements of the sun. In the winter solstice, the light would have pierced the darkness of these halls, illuminating the intricate carvings and signaling the rebirth of the year. It was a union of the celestial and the terrestrial, a way of anchoring the human experience to the eternal cycles of the cosmos. The evidence of social stratification is subtle but undeniable. Not everyone lived in the great halls of the Ness. Nearby, at the village of Skara Brae, we see the more intimate side of Neolithic life. Small, stone-built houses connected by covered walkways, complete with stone beds and dressers. But the Ness was different. It was a place of high ceremony, perhaps reserved for a priestly class or a group of elders who held the secrets of the stars and the stories of the ancestors. The labour required to maintain such a site suggests a hierarchy, a system of governance that could command the resources of the entire archipelago. Yet, for all its power and prestige, the Ness of Brodgar was eventually abandoned. But it was not a sudden flight or a violent end. Instead, it was a deliberate ceremonial closing. In one of the most haunting discoveries in modern archaeology, researchers found that the final act at the Ness was a massive feast involving the slaughter of hundreds of cattle. The bones were left in a pile, and then the great buildings were carefully decommissioned, their roofs removed and their interiors filled with earth. It was as if the people decided that the era of the Ness had come to a natural conclusion, and they chose to bury their past with dignity and reverence. They left behind a landscape transformed, the ring of Brodgar and the stones of Ness, two of the most magnificent stone circles in the world, still stand nearby, acting as silent sentinels of that vanished age. These circles were not built in isolation. They were part of a sacred geography that encompassed the entire island. When we walk among these stones today, we are walking through a memory palace, a physical manifestation of a belief system that saw no separation between the natural and the supernatural. The stones were the bones of the earth, and by raising them, the people of Orkney were giving a voice to the land itself. As we contemplate these massive temple complexes, we are reminded of the limits of our own understanding. We can measure the stones, we can date the charcoal from the hearths, and we can map the post holes in the dirt. But the inner lives of these people, their dreams, their fears, the songs they sang as they worked, remain just beyond our reach, drifting like the sea mist that often rolls in from the Atlantic. The Ness of Brodgar stands as a testament to the fact that sophisticated civilization is not a modern invention. It is a recurring dream, a flame that flickers into life whenever humans find a reason to look up at the stars and wonder. The Ice Age engineers of the North were not primitive survivors clinging to the edge of a frozen world. They were visionaries who understood that to endure, one must build something larger than oneself. They recognized that the true measure of a society is not what it consumes, but what it leaves behind for the ages to come. And as the wind whistles through the gaps in the stones at Brodgar, one can almost hear the echoes of that ancient ambition, a quiet, persistent reminder that we are all merely guests in a world built by those who came before. In the silence of the Orkney night, the stones continue their long vigil, waiting for the next generation to try and decode the secrets they have held for 5,000 years. To understand the mind of the ancient architect, one must first understand the movement of the silver light that defines the northern night. Long before the first foundations of the Great Pyramid were levelled against the sands of Giza, a group of travellers moved across the rugged, peat-covered landscape of the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. They carried with them a knowledge of the heavens that seems to our modern eyes almost impossibly sophisticated. As we leave the windswept circles of Orkney behind, we travel further west, to a place where the land meets the Atlantic in a jagged embrace of gneiss and heather. Here stands Callanish. It is often called the Stonehenge of the North, yet this title feels insufficient, for Callanish possesses a haunting, skeletal grace that Stonehenge, in all its heavy trilithons, cannot quite match. The stones here are thin, jagged shards of Lewisian gneiss, a metamorphic rock that is among the oldest in the world, formed 3 billion years ago in the crushing depths of the Earth's crust. When you touch these stones, you are touching the literal bones of the planet, raised upright by human hands to serve as a bridge between the soil and the stars. The layout of Callanish is unique among the great megalithic sites of the North Atlantic. It is not a simple circle, but a cross-shaped arrangement that fans out from a central ring, with a long double-road avenue stretching toward the north. From above, it looks like a Celtic cross, or perhaps a celestial compass, frozen in stone. But it is only when one remains still, watching the passage of the seasons and the slow, rhythmic dance of the moon, that the true purpose of this engineering marvel begins to reveal itself. While many ancient sites are aligned with the sun, tracking the solstices and equinoxes with predictable regularity, Callanish is tuned to a much more subtle and elusive frequency. It is a temple built for the moon. Every 18.6 years, a phenomenon occurs that astronomers call the major lunar standstill. During this period, the moon reaches its most extreme northern and southern positions on the horizon, rising and setting at points it will not touch again for nearly 2 decades. To a casual observer, the moon's path through the sky seems chaotic shifting slightly every night, but the people of the Neolithic were not casual observers. They were patient. They possessed a sense of time that stretched far beyond the individual human lifespan, a generational memory that allowed them to track a cycle lasting nearly 20 years. At Callanish, the stones were placed with such terrifying precision that during this lunar standstill, the moon does not simply rise. It appears to walk along the horizon. As the full moon nears its southern limit, it skims the tops of the distant hills to the south. These hills are known locally as the Callanish Namointic, or the Old Woman of the Moors. When viewed from the centre of the stone circle, the silhouette of the mountains remarkably resembles a reclining woman, her head, breasts, and knees carved by the glaciers into the horizon. During the standstill, the moon appears to emerge from the very body of this mountain goddess, gliding low along the peaks before dipping into a natural notch in the landscape. And then, in a moment of profound theatricality that must have left the ancient watchers in a state of religious awe, the moon reappears for a brief moment within the centre of the stone avenue itself. It is a celestial alignment that requires not only a deep understanding of three-dimensional geometry, but also an intimate knowledge of the local topography. The stones and the mountains work together as a single, unified machine. One must wonder how many generations of observation were required to perfect this alignment. The builders did not have telescopes or written records, at least none that have survived the damp embrace of the peat. They relied on oral tradition and perhaps wooden markers that have long since rotted away, slowly refining their measurements over centuries until the moment was right to commit their knowledge to the permanence of stone. This suggests a society of immense stability and intellectual continuity, a culture that valued the movements of the cosmos above the fleeting concerns of the everyday. They were the Ice Age engineers, the masters of a lost science that saw no distinction between the spiritual and the mathematical. The stones themselves are weathered and grey, their surfaces etched by thousands of years of salt spray and Atlantic gales. When the sun hits them at a certain angle, the crystals of white quartz and pink feldspar within the gneiss catch the light, making the monoliths seem to glow from within. They stand as silent witnesses to the changing climate of the north. When Callanish was first constructed, roughly 5,000 years ago, the climate was slightly warmer and drier than it is today. The surrounding landscape was not the treeless expanse of peat bog we see now, but a mosaic of scrub woodland and fertile clearings. However, as the centuries passed and the rains increased, the blankets of peat began to grow, slowly swallowing the bases of the stones. By the time modern archaeologists began to clear the site in the 19th century, the peat had risen nearly 5 feet, burying the lower portions of the circle and preserving the original ground level like a time capsule. Beneath this layer of organic decay, researchers found traces of the people who once gathered here. There were fragments of pottery and evidence of small fires, but no signs of permanent habitation within the circle itself. It was a sacred space, a place set apart from the world of the living. In the centre of the main circle lies a small chambered tomb, suggesting that the site served as a link between the celestial cycles of the moon and the ancestral cycles of death and rebirth. Perhaps they believed that by aligning the bones of their dead with the path of the moon, they were ensuring a soul's safe passage through the darkness of the underworld. The sheer scale of the labour involved in creating Callanish is a testament to the collective will of these ancient communities. Each stone, some weighing as much as 5 or 6 tons, had to be quarried, transported across difficult terrain, and manoeuvred into a vertical position using only ropes, wooden levers, and raw human strength. There is a quiet dignity in this effort, a refusal to be forgotten by the tides of time, as the moon rises over the Callanish Namointic, casting long, distorted shadows across the heather. One cannot help but feel a sense of kinship with those distant engineers. They looked at the same silver orb that we see today, and they felt the same human need to find order in the vast, glittering expanse of the night sky. But the mystery of Callanish extends beyond its lunar alignments. There are those who suggest that the site is part of a much larger network of standing stones that once dotted the entire coastline of the North Atlantic, a maritime civilization linked by the sea and the stars. As we move further into the depths of the Neolithic, the evidence of this interconnected world becomes harder to ignore. The stones were not isolated monuments, but nodes in a vast, invisible web of knowledge that stretched from the tip of Scotland to the shores of Brittany and beyond. What were they searching for in the heavens, and why did they feel the need to anchor their discoveries in the heaviest, most enduring material they could find? The answers may be lost to the wind, but the stones remain, patient and unyielding, waiting for the moon to return to its station once more. In the stillness of the Hebridean night, the past does not feel like a distant country. It feels like a presence, watching from the shadows of the gneiss, reminding us that the story of humanity is far older and far more complex than we have ever dared to imagine. Consider for a moment the sound of a heavy weight sliding over frozen earth, a low rhythmic grinding that would have echoed through the valleys of the North Atlantic long before the first pyramids rose from the Egyptian sands. To move a stone weighing 50 tons is not merely a feat of strength, it is a symphony of physics, a calculated dance between gravity and human intent. We often imagine these ancient builders as primitive, struggling against the elements with nothing but raw muscle and desperation, yet the evidence carved into the landscape suggests a far more sophisticated reality. These were the Ice Age engineers, masters of a world where ice and stone were the primary languages of existence. To transport the massive pillars of Lewisian gneiss or the great slabs of basalt, they utilized a system that was as elegant as it was effective. They understood that friction was their greatest enemy, and so they turned to the natural world for a lubricant. Animal fat, rendered into thick, slick grease, would have been applied to wooden sleds and timber tracks, creating a surface where the impossible became manageable. In the deep chill of the northern winter, this grease would thicken, providing a consistent, gliding medium that allowed teams of people to move masses that seem, to our modern eyes, utterly immovable. As we watch these phantom crews in our mind's eye, we see them utilizing the very terrain to their advantage. They were experts in the use of counterweights and levers, long beams of sturdy timber wedged into the earth, turning the pivot of a single point into a force capable of upending the world. They did not fight the earth, they collaborated with it. When a stone needed to be raised, they did not simply pull. They dug deep pits, lining them with smaller stones to create a smooth sliding board. The great megalith would be balanced on the edge of the void, held in place by tension and timing until the moment came to let gravity do the work. With a collective breath, the stone would tip, sliding into its socket with a thunderous impact that must have vibrated through the very soles of their feet. This was not a chaotic process, but one of extreme precision. The alignment of these stones, often within a fraction of a degree, tells us that the engineering began long before the first sled was loaded. It began with the mind, with a standard of measurement that remains one of the great mysteries of the prehistoric world. Archaeologists and researchers have spent decades poring over the dimensions of these circles, and what they found was a haunting consistency across thousands of miles of rugged coastline. They call it the megalithic yard, a standard unit of measure approximately 2.72 feet in length. To find such a precise shared measurement across isolated islands and windswept highlands suggests a level of cultural connectivity that defies our traditional understanding of the late Stone Age. It implies a guild of architects, perhaps, or a travelling class of master builders who carried the secrets of geometry and measure in their memories, passing them down through generations like a sacred liturgy. This unit of measure was not arbitrary. It appears to be derived from the movement of the stars and the diameter of the earth itself, a bridge between the terrestrial and the celestial. When we walk among the stones today, we are walking through a landscape designed with a mathematical rigor that equals our own, a silent testament to a time when humanity viewed the universe as a grand, orderly machine, but the engineering went beyond the physical placement of the stones. These ancient builders were also masters of the senses, selecting their materials with a keen eye for how they would interact with light and sound. They did not simply take the nearest rock. They prospected for specific types of stone, sometimes transporting them over miles of difficult terrain to reach the sacred site. They looked for rocks with high quartz content, stones that would catch the pale northern light and shimmer in the dusk, turning a dark moor into a field of glowing ghosts. Some stones were chosen for their reflective properties, acting as mirrors for the moon during the long winter nights, while others were selected for their internal resonance. When struck, or even when certain frequencies of the human voice are hummed within the circle, these stones vibrate. They have acoustic properties that can amplify sound or dampen it, creating dead zones of absolute silence or echoing chambers where a whisper can be heard from across the diameter of the ring. This is lithoacoustics, the study of the sonic properties of stone, and it suggests that these circles were not just visual monuments, but immersive environments. They were places where the air itself would have felt different, where the low hum of a ritual chant would have resonated in the bones of the participants, blurring the line between the physical body and the ancient rock. Imagine standing in the center of such a circle as the sun begins to dip below the horizon. The stones around you are not just grey monoliths. They are carefully tuned instruments, positioned to capture the dying light and the rising wind. The precision of their placement ensures that at the exact moment of the solstice, a single beam of light might penetrate the darkness of a central chamber, or align perfectly with the edge of a distant peak. This level of planning requires a deep understanding of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers in the Earth's history, and an even deeper patience. These projects often took decades, perhaps centuries, to complete. They were multi-generational labors of love and devotion, built by people who knew they might never see the finished work, yet labored on for the sake of those who would come after. They were anchoring their society in the deep time of the earth, using the most permanent materials available to ensure their message survived the shifting sands of climate and culture. As the years passed and the ice began its final, slow retreat, these engineers left behind a legacy that we are only just beginning to decode. We look at the 50-ton stones and wonder how they did it. But perhaps the more important question is why. Why invest such immense energy into the placement of a single rock? The answer lies in the marriage of the practical and the profound. The engineering was a means to an end, a way to create a permanent interface between the human spirit and the cosmos. The use of sleds, grease, and counterweights was not just a technical solution, it was a ritual act, a demonstration of the power of collective will over the inertia of the natural world. Every inch the stone moved was a victory of the mind over the mountain, and so the megalithic yard becomes more than a ruler. It becomes a symbol of a shared vision, a common language spoken in stone across the vast reaches of the North Atlantic. In the quiet of the present day, when we touch the rough surface of a standing stone, we are touching the work of hands that understood the leverage of the soul. We are feeling the resonance of a world where the engineering of the earth was inseparable from the engineering of the sacred, and where the heavy lifting of the past continues to support the weight of our own wonder. The stones remain heavy and silent, holding the secrets of the grease and the sled, the quartz and the light, waiting for us to remember that we, too, are capable of moving mountains if we only find the right point of balance. Imagine the scent of dried seaweed and peat smoke drifting across a landscape of treeless green, where the wind hums a low, constant note against the edges of sunken stone houses. To understand the hands that raised the great megaliths, we must step away from the shadows of the standing stones and walk toward the low, rounded mounds of the earth that sheltered the living. In the village of Skara Brae, tucked into the curve of the Bay of Scale, we find a world preserved in miniature, a Neolithic sanctuary where time seems to have slowed to the pace of drifting sand. Here the homes are not built upon the land, but nestled within it, linked by low-roofed tunnels that required a visitor to bow their head in a gesture of involuntary respect. Inside these dwellings, the architecture of domestic life is rendered entirely in flagstone. There are stone beds filled with soft heather, stone cupboards with tiered shelves, and central hearths where the embers of a fire once cast a flickering warmth against the walls. It is a space of profound intimacy, where the boundary between the family and the earth was nothing more than a few inches of cold grey rock. Life in these coastal villages was dictated by the rhythm of the tides and the slow turning of the seasons. The people of the North Atlantic were not the primitive wanderers we once imagined, but sophisticated engineers of their own survival. Their diet was a rich tapestry of what the land and sea provided. They were farmers who tended small plots of barley, grinding the grain on stone querns to make a hearty, unleavened bread. They were herders of cattle and sheep, whose bones are found in the middens, the ancient refuse heaps that provide archaeologists with a stratigraphy or a layered history of their daily meals. From the cold waters of the Atlantic they took cod and saithe, and perhaps even the occasional stranded whale, a windfall that would have provided fuel and food for an entire winter. They lived in a state of constant dialogue with the elements, wearing clothing fashioned from animal skins and woven wool, likely dyed with the muted colours of lichen and madder. Every object they touched, from the clay pots decorated with rhythmic grooves to the bone needles used to stitch their garments, was a testament to a life lived with deliberate care. As the years passed, the village was not merely a place of residence, but a node in a much larger network of social and spiritual exchange. While the individual houses provided shelter for the family, the great stone circles served as the living rooms of the entire culture. We might imagine a morning when the mist clings to the ground and groups of travellers arrive from distant settlements, their footsteps muffled by the damp grass. The stone circles were communal meeting places, the Neolithic version of a central square where the business of life was transacted under the gaze of the ancestors. Here, in the shadow of the monoliths, markets would have formed. Rare stones like pitchstone from the Isle of Arran, or polished axe heads from the mountains of Cumbria, were traded from hand to hand, moving across hundreds of miles of sea and moorland. These objects were more than tools. They were symbols of status and connection, physical proof that even in this remote corner of the world, no village was truly an island. The rituals of the stone builders were likely woven into the very fabric of these gatherings. It was not a world where the sacred was kept in a box, brought out only for special occasions. Instead, the sacred was the air they breathed. In the centre of the circles, perhaps contracts were sealed and marriages were celebrated, the permanence of the stones lending a sense of eternal validity to human promises. The communal feasts held at these sites would have been massive undertakings, involving the slaughter of dozens of cattle and the sharing of vast quantities of food. The smoke from these great fires would have risen high into the northern sky, a signal to any who watched from the distant hills that the tribe was gathered, and the old ways were being honoured. There is a sense of profound social cohesion in these ruins, a feeling that every individual was a vital thread in a tapestry that stretched back into the deep time of the Younger Dryas, that final cold snap of the last ice age that had shaped the rugged resilience of their ancestors. Meanwhile, the stones themselves acted as silent witnesses to the evolution of their society. As the population grew and the climate began to subtly shift, the role of the circles may have transformed from simple gathering spots into complex centres of astronomical study and territorial marking. Yet, for the person living in a stone house at Skara Brae, the circles were simply a part of the landscape, as natural as the cliffs or the sea. They were the places where you met your cousins from the next valley, where you heard the news of the southern lands, and where you felt the presence of something much larger than your own brief span of years. The engineering of the stones was matched by an engineering of the soul, a way of structuring the world so that every person knew exactly where they stood in relation to the earth, the stars, and each other. We often wonder what these people spoke of as they sat around their stone hearths, the wind howling outside the thick walls. Perhaps they told stories of the giants who had placed the stones, or of the spirits that lived in the water and the wind. Their clothing, though simple in material, was likely rich in meaning, with patterns that signified lineage and belonging. The social rituals of the stone builders were a way of taming the wildness of the North Atlantic, of creating a pocket of order in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. By building in stone, they were making a claim on the future, ensuring that even after their voices faded, the evidence of their lives would remain. And so, the villages and the circles existed in a symbiotic embrace. The village was the hearth, the place of warmth and sleep, while the circle was the horizon, the place of vision and community. To walk through the narrow passages of Skara Brae today is to feel the ghosts of that daily life, the brush of a sleeve against a stone doorframe, the sound of a child's laughter echoing in a tunnel, the smell of roasting meat. It is a reminder that the builders of the great monuments were not mysterious entities from a mythic past, but people with fears and joys very much like our own. They were engineers who understood that a society is built not just of rock and mortar, but of shared stories and common ground. The stones were the anchors that held their world together, preventing the stories of the living from being swept away by the relentless tides of time. As we look at the remnants of their beds and their cupboards, we are struck by the stillness of the scene, as if the inhabitants had simply stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. This domesticity provides a necessary counterpoint to the grandiosity of the stone circles. It grounds the mystery in the mundane. It tells us that the hands that moved the 50-ton blocks were the same hands that cradled a clay bowl or stitched a leather tunic. The engineering of the North Atlantic was a holistic endeavour, a way of living that recognized no separation between the work of survival and the work of wonder. In the shadow of the stones, life was a slow, deliberate dance, a series of rituals that turned the passing of a day into an act of remembrance. The weight of the past is not just in the megaliths, but in the very floors of the houses where they slept, dreaming of the stars that their stones were built to track. In this quiet corner of the ancient world, we find the roots of our own desire for permanence, for a home that will weather the storms and a place where we can stand together and look up at the infinite sky. The rhythm of the tide is a heartbeat that predates the first stone ever laid by human hands. To understand the builders of the great circles, one must look away from the solid earth and toward the churning, grey-green expanse of the North Atlantic. For a long time we imagined these ancient people as isolated, huddled in small family groups against the wind, separated by vast stretches of inhospitable water. But the evidence suggests a much older, much stranger truth. The sea was not a barrier. It was a superhighway. Imagine a cold, misty morning on the coast of Brittany, thousands of years before the first Roman galley would ever touch these shores. A group of travellers prepares a vessel that looks fragile to the modern eye, yet it is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. It is a boat made not of heavy timber, but of light, flexible frames of willow or hazel, over which thick hides of cattle or seals have been stretched and sealed with animal fat and resin. These skin-covered boats, known to us in later forms as currachs or coracles, were the true chariots of the Ice Age and the centuries that followed. They did not fight the waves, they danced upon them. Because they were light and buoyant, they could ride the swell of the Atlantic, skimming over the surface where a heavier wooden ship might be crushed by the sheer weight of the water. As these ancient mariners pushed off from the southern coasts, they were entering a world of invisible paths, The North Atlantic is a complex web of currents and thermal layers, a shifting map that could be read by those who knew how to look. They watched the flight paths of migrating birds, the behavior of the whales, and the specific color of the clouds that gathered over distant, unseen islands. There is a profound stillness in the idea of a crew drifting through the fog, guided only by the memory of the stars and the taste of the salt in the air. They were not merely surviving, they were exploring, carrying with them the seeds of a culture that would eventually ring the entire Atlantic fringe in stone. The archaeological record speaks of this connectivity in a quiet, persistent voice. When we examine the pottery and the tools found in the earliest layers of Neolithic settlements in Ireland, we find striking similarities to those in the north of Scotland and the western reaches of France. These were not coincidental developments. The design of a bowl, the specific way a flint blade was knapped, and the very concept of the megalith itself travelled in the bellies of those skin boats. We see the spread of passage graves, those complex stone chambers aligned with the sun, appearing almost simultaneously along the Atlantic coastlines. It suggests a shared language of the soul, a unified way of honouring the dead and the heavens that was passed from traveller to traveller, port to port, across hundreds of miles of open water. Think of the courage required to navigate the Irish Sea or the treacherous Minch between the Scottish mainland and the Hebrides in a vessel of leather and wood. Yet the presence of exotic materials proves that these journeys were routine. We find axe heads made of porcelainite from the north of Ireland resting in the soil of the Outer Hebrides. We find pitchstone from the Isle of Arran, transported far into the Scottish Highlands. These objects were more than just tools. They were tokens of a vast trade network that functioned with a sophistication we are only beginning to grasp. The sea allowed for a speed of communication that the rugged, forested interior of the land simply could not provide. In the time it would take to trek across a single mountain range on foot, a skin boat could traverse the coastline of an entire kingdom. As the centuries drifted by, this maritime culture developed a shared architectural vocabulary. The great stone circles were not isolated inventions, but part of a grand conversation. A priest, or an engineer in the Orkney Islands, might have known of the alignments being constructed in Brittany, not through writing, but through the oral traditions carried by the sailors who arrived with the summer tides. They shared stories of how to move stones weighing 30 tons, how to calculate the solstice with nothing but a stick and a shadow, and how to appease the spirits of the deep water. The sea was the medium through which the very idea of the sacred space was refined and polished, like a pebble rolled in the surf. There is a specific kind of silence that exists out on the water, far from the sound of breaking waves or rustling leaves. It is a heavy, expectant silence, where the sky and the ocean seem to merge into a single, infinite blue. It was in this space that the ancient engineers likely felt the smallest, and perhaps where they felt the most connected to the celestial forces they sought to capture in stone. The navigation of the Atlantic required an intimate knowledge of the moon's phases, for the moon governed the tides that could either pull a boat safely into a bay or dash it against the cliffs. This constant, life-or-death observation of the lunar cycle may well be the origin of the complex lunar alignments we find at sites like Callanish. The stones were a way of bringing the wisdom of the sea onto the stability of the land. Meanwhile, the climate itself was a fickle partner in these voyages. During the periods of relative warmth, the seas were calmer, allowing for the expansion of these trade routes. But as the shadows of the younger Dryas, that final bitter cold snap of the Ice Age, lingered in the memory of the culture, or as later fluctuations brought storms and rising levels, the mariners had to adapt. They learned to read the stratigraphy of the water, understanding how the melting ice far to the north changed the salinity and the flow of the currents. This was a science of observation, passed down through thousands of generations, a body of knowledge that has largely been lost to us, buried under the weight of the intervening millennia. As we sit in the modern world, surrounded by steel and glass, it is difficult to fathom the sheer scale of their ambition. We see the ocean as a void, a space to be crossed as quickly as possible, but for the builders of the circles, the Atlantic was a living entity. It was the source of life, the provider of fish and seal, and the bridge to the ancestors. The boats they built were not merely transportation, they were sacred vessels that tied the scattered islands of the north into a single cohesive civilization. The architectural styles we marvel at today, the massive uprights, the lintels, the precise astronomical orientations, were the fruit of this maritime exchange. They were the physical manifestation of a world that was much larger and more interconnected than we ever dared to imagine. The wind that blows through the stones at Stennis or the ring of Brodgar is the same wind that filled the sails of those ancient travellers. If you listen closely, past the sound of the modern world, you can almost hear the rhythmic dip of the oars and the creak of the leather hulls. You can almost see the flicker of a torch on a distant headland, signalling a safe harbour to a boat returning from the far south. The sea remembers these paths, even if we have forgotten them. It carries the echoes of a time when the horizon was not a limit, but an invitation, and when the stones were set not just to mark the land, but to anchor the wandering soul to the rhythm of the universe. And so, the superhighway of the North Atlantic remained open for thousands of years, a silver thread connecting the disparate peoples of the fringe. It was a golden age of movement, a time when ideas flowed as freely as the Gulf Stream, shaping the very foundations of what would become the megalithic tradition. The engineering of the stones and the engineering of the ships were two sides of the same coin. Both required a mastery of physics, a deep respect for the natural world, and a vision that extended far beyond the span of a single human life. As we move deeper into the story of these stone circles, we must keep this watery world in our minds, for the stones were never meant to stand alone. They were always looking out toward the waves, waiting for the next traveller to bring news from the edge of the world. The damp scent of river mist clings to the grass as we follow the slow winding curves of the River Boyne, moving inland from the Irish Sea toward a landscape that seems to hold its breath in the stillness of the morning. Here, in a verdant bend of the water, the earth rises up in great silent swells, as if the land itself were trying to reach for the sky. These are the mounds of Brú na Bóinne, the palace of the Boyne, where the giants of the North Atlantic left their most enduring signatures upon the world. We find ourselves standing before Newgrange, a structure so ancient that it was already thousands of years old when the first stones were dragged into place at Stonehenge, a monument that predates the great pyramids of Giza and the rise of the Mycenaeans. It is a massive, circular cairn, draped in a skin of white quartz that glimmers even under the softest grey light, a beacon that has watched the seasons turn for over 5 millennia. As we approach the entrance, the weight of deep time becomes almost tangible, a heavy, silent pressure against the skin. At the base of the mound lies the entrance stone, a massive slab of sandstone that serves as a threshold between the world of the living and the realm of the eternal. Its surface is a riot of movement, carved with intricate interlocking spirals that seem to rotate and pulse if you watch them long enough in the shifting shadows. These spirals, triple motifs that curl inward upon themselves, are the language of a lost age, a visual symphony written in stone. We do not know the names of the artists who held the flint chisels, nor do we fully understand the grammar of their art, but the elegance of the design speaks of a culture that possessed a profound understanding of geometry and the fluid rhythms of the natural world. Perhaps these spirals represent the path of the sun, or the unfurling of a fern, or the way water eddies in the river just a few hundred yards away. In this place, the barrier between the physical and the symbolic is as thin as a veil of mist. To enter Newgrange is to step out of the flow of linear time and into a long, narrow throat of stone. The passage is tight, the walls composed of massive upright slabs that lean inward, supporting a roof that has not moved a single inch since the late Stone Age. There is a specific, cool stillness here, a silence so profound that you can hear the rhythm of your own heart echoing off the cold rock. As we move deeper, 19 meters into the dark heart of the mound, the air grows heavy and still. We reach the central chamber, a high, vaulted space where 3 smaller recesses branch off like the petals of a stone flower. Looking up, we see the corbelled roof, a masterpiece of Neolithic engineering, where each layer of stone overlaps the one below it, rising higher and higher until a single capstone seals the peak. It is a testament to the skill of these ancient builders that this roof has remained perfectly watertight for 5,000 years, despite the relentless Irish rain that saturates the earth above. Not a single drop of water has ever breached this inner sanctum. The engineers of the Boyne Valley understood the physics of weight and the way water travels through soil, designing a drainage system of grooves in the roof stones that channels moisture away from the chamber, keeping the bones of the ancestors dry through the long passage of the centuries. But the true genius of Newgrange is not found in its ability to keep the world out, but in the precise moment it allows the world in. High above the main entrance, there is a small rectangular opening known as the roof box. For 364 days of the year, this opening serves no obvious purpose, a dark slit in the white quartz facade. But as the winter solstice approaches, the shortest day of the year, when the world is at its darkest, something miraculous happens. As the sun rises over the distant horizon, a single golden beam of light strikes the roof box. Because of the way the passage was perfectly aligned by those ancient astronomers, the light does not hit the floor at the entrance. Instead, it travels the entire length of the narrow hallway, a thin finger of fire stretching through the darkness, until it illuminates the very back of the central chamber. For 17 minutes, the tomb is flooded with a warm, amber glow, a symbolic rebirth of the sun in the belly of the earth. This was not a coincidence or a fortunate accident of geography. It was a calculated feat of celestial mechanics, proving that these people, whom we often dismiss as primitive, had mapped the heavens with a precision that rivals our own. They knew exactly where the sun would touch the earth on the most important day of the year, and they built a mountain of stone to capture that fleeting moment for eternity. A short distance away, the mound of Knowth offers a different, perhaps even more complex mystery. While Newgrange is a monument to the sun, Knowth seems to be a library of the stars and the moon. It is larger than its neighbour, surrounded by a ring of 127 massive curbstones, almost all of which are covered in megalithic art. Here the carvings are different, crescents, circles and wavy lines that some researchers believe represent the phases of the moon and the maps of the local landscape. Knowth possesses 2 separate passages, one facing east and one facing west, aligned with the rising and setting sun on the equinoxes. It is as if the entire valley was a vast, sprawling machine for tracking time, a landscape-scale clock that synchronized the lives of the people with the heartbeat of the cosmos. As we walk around the perimeter of Knowth, the sheer volume of the art is overwhelming. It is the largest collection of megalithic art in all of Europe, a concentrated explosion of human expression that suggests this was not just a burial ground, but a university of the ancient world, a place where knowledge was carved into the very skin of the earth so that it could never be forgotten. We must wonder about the society that could coordinate such a project. To build these mounds required the labor of thousands, the quarrying of stones from miles away, and a surplus of food and resources that implies a highly organized and stable civilization. They were not merely surviving the harsh conditions of the post-Ice Age world. They were thriving, creating a culture of beauty and intellectual rigor. The term Neolithic, meaning New Stone Age, feels inadequate to describe them. They were architects of the invisible, engineers who worked with light and shadow as much as they worked with granite and quartz. As the centuries drifted into millennia, the purpose of these sites began to fade from the collective memory, replaced by the myths of the Tuatha De Danann, the Shining Ones, the people of the goddess Danu, who were said to have retreated into these mounds when the modern world arrived. To the later Celts, these were the gateways to the other world, places where the veil between the dimensions was thin, and where one could speak to the gods if the timing was right. Standing in the shadow of these mounds today, it is easy to feel the weight of that transition. We look at the spirals and the solar alignments, and we feel a kinship with those distant ancestors, a shared desire to find order in the chaos of the universe. The stones of the Boyne Valley are a bridge across the abyss of deep time, reminding us that even in the wake of the melting glaciers, humanity was already looking toward the stars, seeking to anchor itself in the shifting currents of existence. The giants who built these places are gone, their names lost to the wind, but their vision remains carved in the sandstone, waiting for the sun to rise on the winter solstice and breathe life once more into the cold, dark heart of the stone. And as the river continues its slow journey toward the sea, we realize that the story of the North Atlantic is not just one of survival, but one of soaring ambition, a dream of permanence in a world of constant change. Imagine, if you will, the scent of damp earth and the heavy metallic tang of cold stone, a smell that has lingered in the deep recesses of these chambers for 5,000 years. Within the lightless belly of a passage tomb like Newgrange or My Show, the passage of time feels less like a river and more like a heavy, unmoving weight. Outside, the world may be locked in the iron grip of a Neolithic winter, the wind howling across the Irish Sea or the jagged cliffs of Orkney. But here, the air is unnervingly still. It is a silence so profound that one can almost hear the slow, rhythmic pulse of the earth itself. For the people of the North Atlantic, these were not merely graves or monuments. They were sophisticated instruments of light and shadow, designed to capture a single fleeting moment of celestial alignment that occurred only once a year. As the winter solstice approaches, the world outside falls into its deepest slumber, the days shortening until the sun seems almost to have forgotten the northern latitudes entirely. But the engineers of this lost age had not forgotten the sun. They understood the mechanics of the heavens with a precision that continues to baffle modern surveyors. To step into the central chamber of such a structure during the shortest day of the year is to enter a theatre of the sublime. For most of the year, the interior is a void of absolute darkness, a place where the eyes find no purchase and the mind is forced to turn inward. Yet, as the sun begins its shallow climb above the horizon on the morning of the solstice, something miraculous happens. The architects did not simply leave the door open. They constructed what archaeologists call a roof box, a narrow secondary opening positioned precisely above the main entrance. This slit in the stone serves as a cosmic aperture, a way to filter and direct the light of the rising sun so that it travels deep into the heart of the mound. It is a masterwork of stratigraphy, the study of layered earth and stone, and structural engineering, ensuring that the weight of the massive cairn above does not crush the delicate channel through which the light must pass. As the first rays of the solstice sun break over the distant hills, a thin, golden spear of light pierces the roof box. It does not illuminate the entire room at once. Instead, it begins as a small, shimmering coin of light on the floor of the passage, slowly creeping forward, stretching into a long, glowing ribbon that reaches toward the very back of the chamber. For 17 minutes, the darkness is held at bay. The carvings on the walls, the intricate spirals, the nested lozenges, and the zigzags that we struggle to interpret today suddenly leap into high relief. Under the direct touch of the sun,
these ancient symbols seem to vibrate, as if the light has activated a dormant memory within the stone. It is a moment of profound psychological impact, a visual representation of life returning to the land of the dead. One can only wonder what the ancient mind felt in this moment, whether they saw it as a promise of the coming spring or a literal union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, a fertilization of the soil that would ensure the survival of their tribes through another cycle of seasons. The precision required to achieve this is staggering. If the angle of the passage were off by even a fraction of a degree, or if the height of the roof box were miscalculated by a few inches, the light would never reach its destination. It suggests a level of mathematical understanding that predates the formal geometry of the Greeks by millennia. These were the first true physicists of the North Atlantic, individuals who had observed the stars and the movement of the sun for generations, recording their findings not in books, but in the very orientation of the landscape. They were mapping the rhythm of the universe, creating a permanent calendar that would function long after their own voices had fallen silent. As the golden ribbon of light begins to retreat, slipping back down the passage and eventually vanishing as the sun climbs higher in the sky, the chamber is plunged once more into a darkness that feels even deeper than before. This intentional manipulation of light and shadow suggests a culture that viewed the passage of time as something both sacred and cyclical.
There is no linear progression here, only the eternal return. The use of the roof box demonstrates that these people were not merely passive observers of the natural world, they were its choreographers. They had found a way to harness the most powerful force in their lives, the sun, and bring it into the intimate, private space of their most sacred shrines. We must consider the sensory experience of those who waited inside the dark for this light to arrive. In the total absence of visual stimuli, the human brain begins to generate its own imagery, a phenomenon often associated with ritual fasting or sensory deprivation. Perhaps the arrival of the sun was seen as a rescue, a moment of divine intervention that shattered the terrifying isolation of the tomb. The psychological weight of this transition, from the crushing blackness of the earth to the blinding brilliance of the solar fire, would have been an overwhelming experience, one that likely served to solidify the power of the priest-engineers who claimed to understand and control these celestial events. The light displays were not limited to the winter solstice alone. At other sites across the North Atlantic, such as the great mounds of the Boyne Valley or the standing stones of the Outer Hebrides, different alignments speak to different moments in the solar and lunar cycles. Some chambers are positioned to catch the light of the equinoxes when day and night are in perfect balance, while others seem to track the complex 18-year cycle of the moon, known as the lunar standstill. This suggests a multi-generational project of observation, a collective effort to decode the language of the heavens that spanned hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of years. The builders of these stone circles and passage tombs lived in a world of constant flux, where the movements of herds, the ripening of wild grains, and the freezing of the seas dictated the terms of their existence. By anchoring their lives to the fixed points of the stars and the sun, they found a sense of order amidst the chaos. The stone chambers were the anchors of their reality. Even as the forests changed and the coastlines shifted under the melting ice of the late Holocene, the sun would always return to the roof box on the shortest day of the year. It was a guarantee of continuity, a bridge between the fleeting lives of men and the eternal life of the cosmos. As we sit in the silence of our own modern world, it is easy to view these structures as mere curiosities of a primitive age, but when we look closer at the engineering, at the way the sandstone was shaped to catch the light, and the way the shadows were used to create a sense of mystery and awe, we see a reflection of our own desire to understand our place in the universe. The giants of the North Atlantic may be gone, but their light remains. It is a light that still travels across 93 million miles of space to find its way through a narrow slit in a stone roof, illuminating the same spirals that were carved by hands that have been dust for 50 centuries. The shadows in these chambers are long, and they hold the secrets of a civilization that did not need the written word to record its greatest achievements. They wrote their history in the alignment of the earth and the sky, creating a legacy that is only visible to those who are willing to wait in the dark for the sun to rise. And so, as the winter wind continues to blow across the desolate moors and the grey waves crash against the silent stones, we are reminded that the story of humanity is one of seeking the light, even in the deepest, coldest heart of the winter. The engineers of the Ice Age knew that the sun would always return, and in that knowledge they found the strength to build monuments that would outlast time itself, standing as silent witnesses to the enduring power of the human spirit. Imagine for a moment the sound of a voice carrying across a valley, a single thread of melody and meaning that holds the entire history of a people within its vibrations. In our modern world, we are surrounded by the clutter of the written word. We see it on screens, in books, and carved into the very signage of our streets, creating a permanent record that exists outside of our own minds. But for the engineers of the North Atlantic, the architects who moved mountains of granite and sandstone during the thawing edges of the Ice Age, there was no ink, no parchment, and no alphabet to tether their thoughts to the physical world. We find ourselves standing before these colossal rings, searching for a script that does not exist, looking for a Rosetta Stone that was never carved. It is a silence that weighs heavily upon the landscape, a profound absence of written testimony that forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding of human intelligence. We often equate the lack of writing with a lack of complexity. Yet the mathematical precision of these stone circles suggests a mental landscape that was perhaps even more disciplined than our own. These were cultures built upon the art of memory, an oral tradition so robust and so precise that it could transmit complex astronomical data and ancestral lineages across hundreds of generations without the loss of a single detail. In the flicker of the hearth fire, the elders would weave the laws of the stars and the stories of the earth into rhythmic chants, turning the mind of every listener into a living library. But voices fade as soon as the breath leaves the lungs, and the air of the Neolithic does not hold the echoes of what was said. All that remains is the architecture, the silent skeletons of a philosophy we can no longer hear. And so, we must look at the stones themselves not merely as markers or monuments, but as a form of lithic hardware, a permanent hard drive for the collective cultural memory of a civilization. When a community spends decades hauling a 30-ton slab of rock across miles of shifting tundra, they are not just building a temple, they are externalizing their knowledge. The placement of a specific stone in relation to the midsummer horizon acts as a fixed point of data, a physical anchor that ensures the calendar can never be lost, even if the keepers of the oral tradition were to perish. The stones were a way to speak to a future they knew they would never see, using the only medium that could survive the relentless erosion of the North Atlantic climate. They chose the most enduring substance on Earth to house their most fragile ideas, creating a landscape where the geography itself became a manuscript of the stars. As we walk among these giants, we are essentially browsing through a library where the books have no titles and the pages are made of crystalline mineral. The sheer effort required to write in this medium suggests that whatever information was stored here was considered vital for the survival of the species. Perhaps it was the timing of the salmon runs, the shifting patterns of the younger dryas, that final cold snap of the Ice Age, or the complex genealogies that prevented the fragmentation of their small, isolated tribes. By fixing these truths in stone, they ensured that the fundamental laws of their universe remained unchangeable, as solid and unmoving as the bedrock beneath their feet. Yet, as the millennia turned and the climate began to stabilize into the world we recognize today, A strange and quiet transformation occurred. The fever of megalithic building, which had gripped the northern fringes of the world for so long, began to cool. The massive engineering projects slowed, and the stones that had been raised with such Herculean effort were sometimes left to topple, or worse, were ignored by the very descendants of those who built them. We are left to wonder why a culture that had mastered the movement of such immense weights would suddenly lay down its tools. Why did the engineers stop? Some archaeologists suggest that the answer lies in the very success of their mission. As the oral traditions became more settled and the climate more predictable, the need for such gargantuan physical anchors may have diminished. Perhaps the hard drive was full, or perhaps the social structures that demanded such communal labor began to shift toward more individualistic pursuits. There is a theory that the rise of agriculture, the slow, rhythmic turning of the soil, changed the human relationship with time. When you are a hunter-gatherer or a nomadic herder, you look to the distant horizon and the eternal stars for guidance. But when you become a farmer, your eyes are cast downward, toward the furrow and the seed. The vast cosmic clock of the stone circle may have become less relevant than the seasonal pulse of the local field. Others point toward a more somber possibility, a loss of the why behind the how. In the deep time of the North Atlantic, civilizations did not always end with a bang or a great catastrophe. Sometimes they simply drifted away from their original purpose. As the centuries stretched into millennia, the specific meanings of the stones, the names of the stars they pointed to, the specific ancestors they honored, may have blurred into a generalized folklore. The precise scientific instrument became a vague place of myth. When the knowledge that powered the stones was lost, the stones themselves became nothing more than heavy obstacles in a changing world. They became ghosts of an intelligence that had moved on, leaving behind a technology that no one remembered how to operate. It is also possible that the environment itself dictated the end of the megalithic age. As the great forests returned and the open vistas of the Ice Age tundra were swallowed by oak and birch, the clear lines of sight required for astronomical observation were obscured. The sky, once a vast and open scroll, was now glimpsed only through the canopy of leaves. The engineers may have found themselves living in a world that was closing in, a world where the distant horizon was no longer visible, and thus the stones lost their connection to the heavens. The transition from the open, cold plains to the sheltered, green woodlands was a victory for life, but perhaps a defeat for the grand celestial vision of the circle builders. We are left with the fragments of a story told in a language of shadows and light. We use radiocarbon dating to pin these stones to a specific century, measuring the decay of organic isotopes to tell us when a deer antler was dropped in a foundation trench. But carbon cannot tell us what the builders were thinking. We use stratigraphy to study the layers of soil, peeling back the carpet of time to see how the land was shaped, but the dirt does not hold the poems or the prayers of the architects. We are like children who have found a complex machine in the woods. We can marvel at its scale and feel the texture of its components, but the manual has long since rotted away. As the mist rolls in from the sea, shrouding the jagged tops of the megaliths, we are reminded that history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of peaks and valleys. These engineers of the deep past possessed a sophisticated understanding of the world that was eventually misplaced, a specialized wisdom that was surrendered to the changing needs of a new era. The missing records are not a failure of their culture, but a testament to the ephemeral nature of human thought. They lived in a world of sound and memory, a world where the truth was kept alive by the steady beating of a heart and the rhythmic repetition of a song. And so, we stand in the center of the circle, surrounded by the heavy silence of the missing archives. The stones do not speak, yet they communicate a profound sense of continuity. They tell us that even before the first word was ever written, we were a species that hungered for order. a species that looked at the chaos of the wild Atlantic and sought to impose a geometry of meaning upon it. The records may be missing, the voices may be stilled, but the intent remains. In the stillness of the moorland, under the watchful gaze of the ancient granite, we realize that the most important stories are often the ones that are never told in words, but are instead felt in the weight of the stone and the enduring presence of the past. The sound of a hammer striking cold metal is a sharp, discordant note in the long, rhythmic song of the Stone Age, a sound that signaled the beginning of the end for the world of the great circles. For thousands of years, the people of the North Atlantic had lived by the logic of the earth and the sky, their hands familiar with the rough texture of granite and the sharp edge of flint. But as the centuries turned and the second millennium before the Common Era approached, a new substance began to trickle along the coastal trade routes, a heavy, gleaming material that arrived as a whisper and left as a roar. Bronze was more than just a tool. It was a transformation of the very fabric of human existence. It brought with it a different kind of heat, the focused, artificial fire of the furnace, capable of melting the bones of the earth and reshaping them into something unnatural. As this knowledge spread, the social landscape began to fracture, like a sheet of ice under the weight of a heavy foot. In the era of the great stones, power had been communal, a collective effort of hundreds of people working in unison to drag a monolith across a mountain pass. The monuments were for everyone, for the ancestors, for the seasons, for the collective memory of the tribe. But metal changed the math of human value. A bronze dagger or a gold lunula, a crescent-shaped collar that shimmered like a captured piece of the sun, could be owned by a single person. It could be held in the hand, hidden away, or displayed as a mark of singular authority. The focus of human ambition began to pull away from the horizon and the stars, turning inward toward the individual and the prestige that wealth could provide. We see this shift most clearly in the way the dead were treated, the vast communal passage graves, those deep, stony wombs where the bones of generations were mingled together in a democratic tangle of history, began to fall into disuse. In their place, we find the cist and the barrow, small private stone boxes or high earthen mounds designed to house a single important figure. These new leaders were buried with their treasures, their copper axes, their finely worked pottery, and their ornaments of amber and gold. They no longer wished to be part of a collective ancestry. They wanted to be remembered as individuals, standing apart from the crowd even in the silence of the grave. The engineering prowess that had once been dedicated to the alignment of the winter solstice was now redirected toward the glorification of the self. Meanwhile, the great stone circles, those massive weathered sentinels that had watched over the valleys for more than 1,000 years, began to lose their central place in the lives of the people. They did not disappear, of course. A 10-ton block of Lewisian gneiss does not simply vanish, but the atmosphere around them changed. The rituals became smaller, perhaps more secretive, or perhaps they were simply forgotten, replaced by the new demands of a metal-driven economy. The landscape was no longer a sacred map of the heavens. It was becoming a patchwork of territories, of borders, and of resources to be defended. The introduction of metalworking brought with it the introduction of organized warfare on a scale the stone builders might not have recognized. A stone axe is a tool that can be used as a weapon, but a bronze sword is a weapon that has no other purpose. As the years passed, the climate itself seemed to conspire against the old ways. The long, relatively stable period that had allowed the great Neolithic cultures to flourish began to falter. The weather turned colder and wetter. The peat bogs began to creep across the upland moors, swallowing the fields and the sacred paths. In the highlands and the islands of the North Atlantic, the once productive soil became acidic and waterlogged. The people who had lived in the shadow of the circles were forced to move, to consolidate, and to fight for the dwindling patches of fertile ground. In such a world, the luxury of spending decades moving stones to track the moon must have seemed like a dream from a distant, unrecognizable past. The transition was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, melancholic fading. It is a process that archaeologists often call the Bronze Age shift, but that clinical term fails to capture the profound sense of loss that must have accompanied it. Imagine a village where the oldest members still remembered the stories of the great stones, the songs that were sung as the pillars were raised, while the young men were more interested in the quality of a tin shipment from the south or the strength of a new alloy. The circles became ruins in their own time, ghosts of an architectural language that no one spoke fluently anymore. They remained as landmarks, as places of occasional gathering, or perhaps as objects of superstitious awe, but the deep mathematical connection to the cosmos had been severed. And so, the era of the engineers, those master builders who understood the weight of the earth and the rhythm of the stars, drew to a close. They left behind no written records, no names of their kings, no accounts of their discoveries. They left only the stones and the silence. As the Bronze Age matured into the Iron Age, and the Iron Age into the world we recognize today, the circles were left to the elements. The lichen grew over the carvings, the frost split the granite, and the earth slowly rose to meet the bases of the monoliths, burying their foundations in the debris of time. We look at them now and wonder how they could have been so easily abandoned, how a culture capable of such monumental vision could simply turn away and walk into a different future. But perhaps they didn't turn away. Perhaps the knowledge didn't vanish, but was simply transformed, absorbed into the folklore and the hidden traditions that would eventually become the myths of the Celts and the Norse. The stones stayed where they were because they were too heavy to move, and because deep down every subsequent generation felt a lingering hesitation to disturb them. There is a weight to these places that transcends the physical, a sense that the ground itself remembers the feet of the thousands who once gathered there. As the metal-clad warriors and the merchants of the New Age passed by the circles on their way to the coast, they must have looked at those grey, leaning shapes and felt a shiver of recognition, a reminder that before the gold and the bronze there was the stone, and before the individual there was the whole. The great stone circles of the North Atlantic stand today as the ultimate testament to a lost priority. They remind us that there was once a time when the most important thing a human being could do was to find their place in the universe, to align their life with the rising of the sun and the setting of the stars. In our modern world of steel and silicon, where everything is fleeting and the individual is the measure of all things, the stones offer a different perspective. They invite us to slow down, to feel the texture of the deep time that flows through the landscape, and to recognize that we are merely the latest inhabitants of a world that was shaped by giants long before we arrived. The engineers of the Ice Age may be gone, their names dissolved into the Atlantic mists, but their geometry remains etched into the moorland, waiting for someone to stop, to listen, and to remember. The wind that screams across the Outer Hebrides today carries a salt-heavy bite, a sharp reminder of the Atlantic's relentless power. To stand among the stones of Callanish or the ring of Brodgar is to witness a quiet miracle of endurance. These megaliths have not merely existed, they have endured a siege of millennia, standing firm while the very soil beneath them shifted, and the climate of the world turned cold, and then warm, and then cold again. It is a testament to the foresight of those Ice Age engineers that they chose lithic materials capable of withstanding the chemical erosion of the sea spray and the physical battering of gale-force winds. The Lewisian gneiss, for instance, is one of the oldest rocks in the world, a metamorphic titan that was already billions of years old when the first human hands carved it into a celestial marker. Its crystalline structure resists the creeping fingers of frost, allowing the stones to remain sharp-edged and defiant, while the softer hills around them are slowly ground down by the elements. As the centuries drifted into the medieval period, the climate of the North Atlantic began to shift into a long, dark epoch known to historians as the Little Ice Age. From the 14th century until the middle of the 19th, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a significant drop in temperature. The seas grew violent, the growing seasons shortened, and the great stone circles were often swallowed by shifting snowdrifts and expanding peat bogs. Yet, in a strange twist of environmental fate, this cooling period may have acted as a shroud of protection for the sites. As the ground froze and the heather grew thick and insulating, the base of the stones, where the most vital archaeological evidence, such as pottery shards and charcoal remains, is found, was locked away in a deep freeze. The expansion of the peat, fueled by the damp and cooling air, slowly rose around the waists of the giants, burying their lower halves in an acidic, oxygen-free environment. This natural preservation process prevented the stones from toppling and shielded the ground surface from the trampling of livestock or the curiosity of early treasure hunters. The circles became islands in a sea of moss, silent and half-submerged in the earth's slow memory. During these long, frozen centuries, the original purpose of the stones, the sophisticated mathematics and the precise solar alignments, faded from the collective mind of the people living in their shadows. The knowledge of the younger Dryas, that sudden and brutal return to glacial conditions 12,000 years ago, was lost to the mists of time. In its place, a new kind of history began to grow, a tapestry of folklore and myth that sought to explain the presence of these impossible structures. To the medieval mind, it was inconceivable that mere men, especially those living in the primitive past, could have moved such immense weights. And so, the stories told by the hearth fire spoke of giants who had been turned to stone by the rising sun, or of ancient processions of dancers who had been frozen in place for breaking the Sabbath. There was a lingering sense of the uncanny about these places, a feeling that the stones were not entirely inanimate, but rather held a dormant life that might awaken under the right lunar conditions. In the highlands and the islands of the North Atlantic, the stones became known as the Fyrbraig, the false men. Travellers caught in the sudden thick fogs of the moors would often mistake the distant upright silhouettes for standing figures, only to find, upon drawing closer, that they were addressing cold, unblinking pillars of rock. This name carries a weight of lonely mystery, a recognition that the stones possess a human-like presence that transcends their geological reality. Some villagers believed the stones moved at night to drink from the nearby lochs, while others whispered that the circles were gateways to the subterranean realms of the Side, the hidden people who lived beneath the mounds. These legends were not merely superstitions. They were a way for the human spirit to bridge the gap between the known world and the deep, silent antiquity of the landscape. The stones were treated with a mixture of reverence and dread, a cultural taboo that, perhaps more than anything else, ensured their survival. While other ancient monuments were dismantled to build fences or barns, the great circles were often left alone, guarded by the ghosts of the stories told about them. Meanwhile, the earth continued its slow, rhythmic breathing. The Little Ice Age eventually waned, and the snows began to retreat, revealing once again the full height of the megaliths. The peat, however, remained, holding the secrets of the engineers in its dark, damp layers. When modern archaeologists finally began to peel back these layers of moss and time, They found that the stones were not just standing on the ground, but were anchored deep within it, sometimes surrounded by elaborate packing stones and layers of white quartz that shimmered when the light hit them. The weathering on the faces of the stones tells a story of constant change, the way the rain has carved tiny channels into the gneiss, and the way the lichens have painted the surfaces in shades of orange, grey, and neon green. These lichens are themselves ancient organisms, some of them hundreds of years old, growing at a rate of less than a millimetre a year, a living clock that measures the passage of time on a scale that dwarfs a human life. As we look upon these weathered sentinels today, we are seeing the result of a long dialogue between human intent and the forces of nature. The engineers of the Ice Age knew that their work would have to face the ocean's fury, and they built accordingly. They understood the physics of weight and balance, but they also seem to have understood the psychology of permanence. By creating something that looked and felt like a part of the natural world, they ensured that even when their civilization crumbled, their markers would remain. The stones have become a part of the ecology of the North Atlantic, nesting sites for birds, anchors for the wind-blown seeds of the moorland, and landmarks for the weary traveller. They remind us that the things we build today, our glass towers and concrete highways, are fragile things compared to the raw, enduring power of stone and story. The mystery of how they survived is not just a question of geology or climate, but a question of meaning. The stones survived because they were too heavy to move, too sacred to destroy, and too strange to ignore. They weathered the storms of the Little Ice Age and the shifting tides of human belief, standing as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires they never knew. As the Atlantic mists roll in once again, draping the circles in a cold grey veil, the stones seem to settle further into the earth, as if they are waiting for the next great cycle of the world to begin. They are the anchors of our history, the heavy, unmoving points around which the chaos of the millennia revolves. And in their stillness there is a profound sense of peace, a realization that even in a world of constant change, some things are built to last forever. The silence of these stones remained largely undisturbed for thousands of years, a secret kept by the peat and the heather, until the arrival of the 19th century antiquarians. These were men of a different age, an era of candlelight, ink-stained fingers, and a growing obsession with the deep roots of the British Isles. They arrived on the windswept coasts not with excavators or complex machinery, but with leather-bound sketchbooks and brass measuring chains. One can almost see them now, their heavy wool coats damp with the Atlantic spray, kneeling in the tall grass to trace the weathered curve of a monolith. They were the first to truly look at these circles not as mere piles of rock or obstacles for the plough, but as a language that had been forgotten by the tongue, yet remained written upon the land. These early scholars, such as the meticulous Alexander Thom or the wandering artists of the Victorian era, spent weeks in the isolation of the Outer Hebrides and the Orkney Isles. They worked with a quiet, patient intensity, mapping the positions of the stones against the rising of the midsummer sun and the setting of the winter stars. They were limited by the tools of their time, and yet their hand-drawn maps possessed a strange, haunting accuracy. They sensed that these circles were part of a grander design, a network of geometry that spanned the northern seas. As they measured the distance between the fallen pillars, they began to realize that the builders of the Ice Age had possessed a sophisticated understanding of the horizon. To these antiquarians, the circles were like the gears of a great frozen clock, stopped at a moment in time that was already ancient when the Romans first set foot on these shores. And so, the rediscovery of the North Atlantic circles began in the quiet libraries and drawing rooms of the 1800s, but as the centuries turned, our ability to see the past underwent a profound transformation. Where the antiquarians saw only what was visible to the eye, modern archaeology has learned to peer through the very skin of the earth. In the last few decades, the search for these hidden engineers has moved from the ground to the heavens. We now use satellite imagery to scan the remote corners of the North Atlantic, looking for the telltale ghosts of circles that have long since been swallowed by the encroaching bogs. From hundreds of miles above, the landscape reveals patterns that are invisible to a person standing in the center of a field, subtle depressions in the soil, or the way the light hits a particular rise in the moorland, betraying the presence of a buried monument. Perhaps the most revolutionary tool in this modern quest is LiDAR, a technology that uses pulsed laser light to measure distances to the Earth's surface. It is a form of digital stripping, a way to peel back the layers of dense forest, thick heather, and centuries of agricultural runoff to see the raw shape of the ground beneath. When the LiDAR maps are processed, the results are often breathtaking. Sites that were thought to be lone, standing stones are suddenly revealed to be part of vast, sprawling complexes. We see the faint outlines of processional avenues, the circular ditches of vanished henges, and the foundations of timber halls that once stood alongside the stone. It is as if a veil is being lifted, showing us that the Ice Age world was far more crowded and far more organized than we ever dared to imagine. These digital ghosts remind us that for every stone circle we can see and touch, there are likely a dozen more sleeping just beneath our feet, waiting for the right light to find them. As these sites emerge from the shadows of prehistory, they bring with them a new set of challenges. The rediscovery of these ancient wonders has sparked a global fascination, drawing travelers from every corner of the world to the remote edges of the Atlantic. There is a deep human desire to stand within the center of a circle, to feel the weight of the millennia, and to touch the cold, lichen-covered surface of a stone that was raised by hands 10,000 years ago. And yet, this very curiosity creates a delicate, often precarious balance. The sites are fragile. Their stability depends on the integrity of the soil and the silence of the landscape. Every footfall on the soft peat, every hand pressed against the stone carries with it a tiny, imperceptible erosion. Preserving these wonders requires a grace that is difficult to maintain in a modern, fast-paced world. We find ourselves acting as the stewards of a legacy we still do not fully understand. In places like the Ring of Brodgar or the Standing Stones of Callanish, the task is to allow the public to experience the awe of the past without destroying the very thing they have come to see. It is a slow, thoughtful process, building wooden walkways that float above the sensitive ground, or limiting the number of visitors who can enter a site during the damp winter months. There is a tension between our need to know and our duty to protect. We want to dig, to probe, and to analyze the soil for radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint exactly when a piece of charcoal or bone was left behind. We want to study the stratigraphy, the layers of earth that act like the pages of a book, telling the story of who lived here and when. But with every excavation, a part of the mystery is forever altered. Once the earth is moved, it can never be put back exactly as it was, and so the modern archaeologist often chooses the path of restraint, using non-invasive sensors and ground-penetrating radar to see inside the earth without ever breaking the surface. They move with a quiet reverence, aware that they are trespassing on sacred ground. Meanwhile, the stones themselves remain indifferent to our efforts. They have survived the melting of the great ice sheets, the rising of the oceans, and the fall of countless empires. They do not care for our maps or our satellites. They simply exist, enduring the wind and the rain as they have always done. As we look toward the future of these sites, we are forced to confront the limits of our own knowledge. We may map every stone and date every fragment of flint, but the true essence of the circles, the thoughts of the people who built them, the songs they sang, and the reasons they chose these specific lonely spots, may always remain just out of reach. Perhaps that is how it should be. The preservation of these sites is not just about keeping the stones standing, it is about preserving the sense of wonder they inspire. It is about protecting the silence that allows us to listen to the echoes of the Ice Age. In the balance between tourism and conservation, between the digital map and the physical stone, we find a reflection of our own place in time, a brief moment of awareness in a history that stretches back into the dark, cold mists of the younger Dryas. We are the latest in a long line of witnesses, and as we walk among the giants of the North Atlantic, we are reminded that some things are meant to be cherished, but never truly owned. Consider for a moment the texture of the lichen that clings to the windward side of a standing stone, a slow-growing velvet map of centuries, creeping across a surface that was already ancient when the first pyramids were being surveyed in the desert sands. These stones do not merely sit upon the land, they have become part of its very respiration, drawing in the damp salt air and exhaling the scent of damp earth and forgotten lithium. As we stand here, the boundary between the modern observer and the Ice Age engineer begins to thin, worn away by the persistent rhythm of the North Atlantic waves. We are left with a profound sense of continuity, a realization that the hands which heaved these blocks into place were driven by the same curiosities that lead us to study them today. They looked at the same constellations, though the stars have shifted their positions by a fraction of a degree over the millennia, and they felt the same chill of the encroaching winter. The silence that inhabits these circles is not an empty one. It is a dense, heavy presence, filled with the weight of 10,000 years of snowfall and the soft, repetitive sigh of the grass bending in the gale. When the wind drops, the stillness is so absolute that one can almost hear the slow, tectonic pulse of the earth itself. In this quietude, the technicalities of radiocarbon dating and the complexities of stratigraphy, the study of the layers of soil that act as a diary of the planet, seem to fall away. We are no longer calculating dates or measuring diameters. We are simply existing in the company of giants who have outlasted every empire, every language, and every god that has risen and fallen since the glaciers retreated. As the light begins to soften, turning the grey granite into shades of deep violet and bruised blue, the stones seem to grow taller, their shadows stretching out like long, dark fingers across the heather. There is a specific quality to the twilight in these northern latitudes, a lingering, pearlescent glow that refuses to yield to the night. In this half-light, the precision of the Ice Age engineers becomes even more haunting. You can see how the edges of the stones catch the final rays, marking the passage of the seasons with a reliability that puts our digital clocks to shame. It is a form of permanence that we, in our era of flickering screens and disposable structures, find difficult to truly comprehend. The men and women of the younger Dryas, that sudden, final cold snap of the last great frost, did not build for a lifetime. They built for the duration of the world. And so, we find ourselves lingering, hesitant to leave the circle, as if stepping outside the perimeter of stones would mean stepping back into the frantic current of the present day. Inside the circle, time feels circular rather than linear. The past is not something that happened and ended, it is something that is still happening, vibrating within the crystalline structure of the rock. We might wonder what they whispered to these stones as they settled them into their sockets, what hopes they buried beneath the foundation deposits, what fears they sought to calm by aligning their lives with the predictable movements of the moon. But the stones keep their secrets well. They offer no easy answers, only a steady, unwavering presence that suggests that perhaps the questions themselves are more important than the conclusions. The earth beneath our feet is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased and written upon again. Beneath the modern turf lies the peat, and beneath the peat lies the glacial till, and beneath that the bones of a landscape that was once carved by ice 2 miles thick. The engineers who stood here understood this better than we do. They lived in the shadow of the melt, witnesses to a world that was changing with a terrifying, beautiful speed. Their response to that instability was to create something that could not be moved, something that would remain even if the forests drowned and the tundras turned to sea. They were anchoring themselves to the bedrock of reality, ensuring that, even if their names were lost to the wind, their intent would remain etched into the horizon. As the stars begin to flicker into existence above the lintels, one by one, we are reminded of our own fleeting transit. The Great Bear circles the pole, just as it did when the first fires were lit within these enclosures. The cold air settles into the hollows of the land, bringing with it a clarity of thought that only comes in the deep hours of the night. We are the inheritors of a mystery that may never be fully solved, and perhaps there is a certain comfort in that. To know everything would be to strip the world of its wonder, to turn these majestic sentinels into mere data points on a chart. Instead, we are left with the mystery, the beautiful, enduring silence of the stones. Meanwhile, the tides continue their patient work along the coast, grinding the fallen cliffs into sand, slowly reclaiming the land that the ice once gave up. The stone circles stand as a defiant gesture against this erosion, a testament to the human desire to be remembered, to be seen, and to belong to something larger than the self. As we finally turn to walk away, the sound of our footsteps is swallowed by the moss, leaving the giants to their nocturnal vigil. They do not need our understanding to exist. They do not need our theories to stand tall. They simply are. The passage of time is not a thief, but a sculptor, smoothing the sharp edges of the granite and deepening the grooves of the carvings until they look like natural ripples in the stone. And as the centuries continue to roll by, like waves breaking against a distant shore, these monuments will remain, watching the sky, waiting for the return of the sun, and holding the memory of the Ice Age engineers in a grip that will not loosen until the earth itself grows cold. We leave them now to the starlight and the wind, grateful for the brief moment we were permitted to stand among them, and for the reminder that in the vast, dark ocean of history there are still islands of permanence that can guide us home. The night is full of a soft, rhythmic breathing, the sound of the world asleep, and in that sleep the past and the present are one. The stones are warm with the memory of the day's sun, and the earth is steady, and the sky is infinite. We drift now into that same stillness, carrying with us the image of the great circles, standing silent and strong at the edge of the world until the morning comes again.